My name is Cora Ellison. I'm 27 years old. The night before the most important interview of my life, my younger sister Vivian stood in the doorway of our mother's laundry room, unscrewed the cap off a full gallon of bleach, and poured the whole thing straight down the front of my only good blazer, while she looked me dead in the eye and smiled. I didn't move. I just stood there, the iron still hot in my hand, watching the navy wool drink it up, watching the stain bloom orange and yellow like a bruise that was in a hurry. And my mother, sitting 15 feet away on her cream-colored couch, didn't even lift her eyes from her phone. She just said, cold as a closed door, "Stop making a scene, Cora. It's a jacket. You've always been so dramatic." Then my father, halfway into his second glass of wine, added, "Your sister is going through a lot right now. Don't ruin this for her." I wore that blazer anyway. 6 hours later, I was sitting across a wooden desk from the dean of admissions of one of the best medical schools in the country. And I watched his eyes drop to the bleach stain on my chest, then move up to the name on my file, and something moved across his face that I will never forget for as long as I live. He didn't ask me another question. He stood up. He walked to the second drawer of his desk. He pulled out a single folded piece of paper that had been sitting in that drawer for 14 months, waiting for me. And he looked at me and said, in almost a whisper, "Wait. You're her." What my family spent years trying to make small, what they poured bleach on and told me to be quiet about, was about to become the exact thing that took down everything they'd built. But to understand how a ruined jacket burned their whole world to the ground, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to meet a little girl named Iris. And you have to understand a rule about a locked drawer that I learned when I was 10 years old. So stay with me. Because this one you're going to want to see all the way through. If you've ever been the child your family quietly decided to make smaller, the one they clapped for politely while they saved the spotlight for someone else, then I need you to do something for me right now. Tap that like button. It tells the algorithm to push this story to the next person who needs to hear it, someone out there who feels exactly the way you and I have felt. And subscribe, because the way this ends, the last 10 minutes. I promise you did not see it coming, and I don't want you to miss it. One more thing before we start. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now, the city, the state, the country. I read these. It reminds me that none of us watching this are as alone as we were taught to feel. Okay. Come sit down. Let me tell you how it really happened. I grew up in a 6-bedroom house in Kenilworth, Illinois, one of those quiet, tree-lined North Shore towns outside Chicago where the lawns are cut in perfect stripes and nobody ever raises their voice, because raising your voice would mean something was wrong, and nothing was ever allowed to be wrong out loud. My father, Douglas Ellison, was a senior partner at a private equity firm downtown. My mother, Marguerite, sat on the board of the Chicago Symphony and 2 hospital foundations. From the outside, we were the kind of family that got photographed for the neighborhood magazine every spring, standing on the porch in matching pale colors, smiling like we meant it. I was the older daughter. Vivian came along 3 years after me. And from the day my sister was born, my mother talked about her in a different voice. Vivian had the right kind of face. Vivian had the laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. Vivian had, and I heard my mother say this word so many times it stopped sounding like a word, presence. I remember a piano recital when I was 11. I'd practiced one piece for 4 months. I walked out on that stage in a stiff velvet dress, and I played the whole thing without missing a single note. When I came off, my mother kissed my forehead and said, "That was nice, Cora." And then she turned to my sister, who was 8 and had quit piano a year before, and she said to the woman next to her, "But Vivian has the kind of face people remember. Let her sit up front tonight." That was the whole house, right there, in one sentence. There was one daughter to be proud of. And there was me, the one who did the work. I want you to hold on to that word for a second, drawer. Because when I was 10 years old, I opened one I wasn't supposed to. And it would take me 16 years to understand why that mattered. I was looking for a pair of tights. That's all. It was a cold morning, I was late for school, and I opened the second drawer of my mother's dresser, the one just below the top. She caught me before I'd even moved the scarves aside. She didn't yell. My mother never yelled, that was for people without control. She crossed the room, put her hand flat on the drawer, and closed it slowly, right in front of me. And she looked down at me and said, very calmly, Cora. This drawer is private. I don't go through your things. You do not go through mine. That is how this house works. I said I was sorry. I was 10. I never opened that drawer again. I want you to remember it, though, the second drawer, just below the top, under the folded scarves. Because 16 years later, on the worst night of my mother's life, I was going to open it one more time. And what I found inside was going to end everything. When I was 16, I sat at the dinner table and said, out loud for the first time, that I wanted to be a doctor. My father set his fork down. My mother smiled at me, that patient, gentle smile you give a child who just announced she's going to be an astronaut. She didn't say no. She didn't have to. Because the very next week, at a fundraiser downtown, I heard her tell a friend, Vivian wants to be a pediatrician, you know. She's always had such a way with children. Vivian was 13. Vivian had never once mentioned it. And a few nights after that, my father came and sat on the edge of my bed. He folded his hands and said, Cora, medicine is a long, hard road. Your sister has the temperament for it. You're better suited to a support role. That's not an insult, it's just an observation. He truly believed he was being kind to me. But by 16, I understood the truth of my own house. My family had already chosen which daughter would be the doctor. They'd sorted us years ago, the way you sort mail. They'd just forgotten to tell me I'd lost. So I stopped asking them for anything. I applied to college on my own. I wrote the essays at the kitchen table after everyone went to bed, and I never showed a single one to my parents. I got into DePaul in the city. When I told them, my mother tilted her head and said, DePaul is fine. It's not a name we'd brag about. But it's fine. And my father said the sentence that I carried in my chest for the next 10 years. He said, don't expect us to pay for medical school after this, Cora. Your sister is the one we're saving for. So I paid for it myself. All of it. I worked 2 jobs through college, front desk at a gym at 5 in the morning, tutoring chemistry at night. I graduated with honors in biology and a stack of loans taller than I was. And 3 weeks later, I signed a lease on a tiny 1-bedroom on the north side of Chicago and started my first real job. I became a patient navigator in the pediatric oncology program at one of the big children's hospitals downtown. My job was to walk families through the worst days of their lives. To translate the medicine into plain words. To sit with people when the doctors had run out of time to sit. To be there, that was the whole job. To simply be there. The starting salary was $58,000 a year. When I told my mother what I did for a living, she frowned a little and said, a patient navigator? Isn't that more of a volunteer sort of thing? Do they even pay you for that? Meanwhile, 3 years behind me, Vivian had started college, and my mother managed her path like it was one of her charity galas. There was a private tutor for the medical entrance exam, $12,000. There was an admissions consultant in the city. There were shadowing spots arranged through donors my parents knew. There were anatomy textbooks bought in advance and left on Vivian's shelf like decoration. My mother told everyone at her dinner parties that Vivian had been shadowing at the children's hospital for over a year, that she had such a gift with sick kids. Now hold on to that, because I pulled the visitor logs later. And I'm going to show you the exact number of hours my sister really spent on that oncology floor. It is going to be a much, much smaller number than you think. But before any of that, before the interview, before the hearing, before I opened that drawer, I have to tell you about the little girl who changed my whole life. Because none of the rest of it makes sense without her. Her name was Iris. Iris Delgado was 7 years old when she was diagnosed with leukemia. Her mother, Marisol, was 38, a housekeeping supervisor at a hotel near the airport. Marisol had come to this country from Guatemala when she was young. Iris's father had been a construction worker, a good man, everyone said, and he'd been killed on a job site when Iris was 3. So Marisol had been raising her little girl completely alone for 4 years when the doctors said the word cancer. The first time I walked into room 4B, Marisol was crying in the corner as quietly as a person can cry. Iris was sitting up in the bed with her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was in church. The medical team had just left. They'd explained the treatment plan too fast, in too many long words, and Marisol's English, strong enough for ordinary days, hadn't been able to catch it all. She didn't know what half of it meant. And little Iris had gotten it into her head that they were going to put her to sleep forever. So I sat down on the edge of that bed, and I switched into Spanish. I told Marisol what the first month of treatment meant, slowly, one piece at a time, the strongest, hardest month, the one that would either push the cancer back or tell us what kind of fight we were in for. And then I turned to Iris, and I told her the truth in a way a 7-year-old could hold. Nobody is going to put you to sleep forever, Mija. You're going to be very, very tired for a while. But tired isn't gone. Tired is still here. And when I stood up to leave that night, that little girl reached out from under the blanket and took my hand. She didn't say a word. She just held on. I didn't know it yet, but in that moment, Iris had decided something about me. And she was going to spend the last years of her short life making sure the whole world found out. I came back the next day. And the day after that. Then every day for a week. Then 4 to 6 hours a week, on top of my regular caseload, for 2.5 years. If this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest, if you've ever been the person who shows up for someone when nobody's watching, do me a favor and type one word in the comments for me, heard. Just that. I'll explain why later. But I want to know how many of you are out there. Iris's room faced the elevated train tracks. Her room had been assigned by luck of the draw, but she treated it like the best gift anyone had ever given her. Every single morning, even on the mornings she was too sick to eat, she'd wait by that window for the first brown line train to rattle past in the gray light. And she'd whisper the same thing every time, half to me, half to herself. It came back. So I came back too. I used to read to her in the chemo room. Her favorite was The Velveteen Rabbit, the old story about a stuffed toy that wants to become real. There's a part where the rabbit asks the wise old horse what it means to be real, and the horse says it isn't about how you're made, it's a thing that happens to you, over a long time, when someone loves you. Iris made me read that part over and over. One afternoon, halfway through, she looked up at me and said, "Cora, do you think somebody will write something nice about me someday?" And I said, "Of course they will, sweetheart. Of course somebody will." I had no idea that she was already planning to make sure of it. She used to keep a little cup of crayons on the windowsill, and on her good days she'd draw the train going by, always with too many windows, always with a sun stuck up in the corner no matter what time it was. And she'd narrate the people inside it for me. That one's going to work. That one's late. That one's going to see his grandma. She gave every stranger on that train a whole life. That was the thing about Iris, she noticed people. She noticed me. On the days the medicine made everything taste like metal and she couldn't hold anything down, she'd still ask me how my morning was, if I'd eaten, if I was tired. A dying child, worrying about whether I'd had breakfast. There was a night near the end of that second year when her fever spiked and she got scared in the dark, and she gripped my sleeve and asked me, very small, "Am I still here?" And I told her, "You're still here, baby. I've got your hand. You're still here." And she nodded, and she went back to sleep. I sat in that chair until the first train came by at dawn. She woke up just enough to see it, and she smiled, and she whispered it. It came back, so I came back too, and then she slept the whole morning. I didn't know I was memorizing her. I thought we had more time. That's the thing nobody tells you. You always think you have more time. Now, remember I told you my mother said Vivian had been shadowing on that oncology floor for over a year? I finally pulled the official visitor badge logs. Every person who steps onto that unit has to badge in and badge out. It's tracked to the minute. In 3 years, my sister Vivian badged onto that floor exactly 4 times. Total time, start to finish, all 4 visits combined, 5 hours and 22 minutes. And not one of those 4 visits was ever inside Iris's room. My sister never met her. Not once. Over those same years, I logged more than 3,200 hours on that unit. 1,100 of them were with Iris and her mother alone. One of us lived that little girl's life beside her. The other one badged in for 5 hours across 3 years and never even learned her name. Only one of us was about to be told, in a room full of witnesses, that those numbers mattered. In the summer after her 2nd year of treatment, Iris relapsed. She was 8. The bone marrow transplant we'd all been praying for never happened, the matches just weren't close enough. Through that next year, she got smaller and smaller. And that fall, the doctors moved her to hospice care. The one who had to tell Marisol there were no more options was Dr. Anneliese Voigt, a pediatric blood specialist who'd trained in Germany and spent 19 years at that hospital. A brilliant, careful woman. Remember her name. She matters more than you'd think. 2 weeks before Iris died, when she was very weak but very, very clear-headed, she asked her mother to write a letter for her. Marisol sat by the bed with a pencil and a scrap of paper, and she wrote down exactly what her daughter told her to write, word for word, in her own handwriting. It was 1 page. Some of the words were in Spanish, with the little accent marks Marisol always drew so carefully. It was Iris's voice, in her mother's hand. I didn't see that letter for a long time. But when I finally did, when a stranger read it out loud to me across a desk, it undid me completely. The letter was addressed, in a 9-year-old's imagination, to the people who choose who gets to be a doctor. And a week after Iris dictated it, Marisol handed that folded letter to Dr. Voigt during morning rounds and said, in careful English, "Please give this to someone who can help Cora become a doctor." Now here's where 2 worlds that were never supposed to touch, were about to slam together. Because the very next day, that hospital held its annual luncheon to thank its big donors. Families were invited to come and say thank you. Marisol went. And so did my mother, Marguerite Ellison, who sat on the board of one of the foundations that funded that exact program. The 2 of them had never met in their lives. But they were about to. And one of them was carrying something that belonged to me. Marisol recognized my mother from across the room. Months earlier, I'd shown Iris and Marisol a photo on my phone, my family, stiff and smiling at Christmas. Marisol never forgot a face. So at that luncheon, she walked up to this elegant, put-together woman in pearls, and she said, "Excuse me. You're Cora's mother. I have something for Cora." And she handed my mother a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing. Iris had made it with hospital sketch paper and a plain pencil. It showed a little girl in a hospital bed, and a woman in scrubs sitting beside her, holding her hand, the 2 of them looking right at each other. And on the back, in shaky pencil, in a dying child's handwriting, were 5 words. Marisol looked my mother in the eye and said, "It's for Cora. For when she graduates. Please give it to her." And my mother smiled her lovely charity luncheon smile and said, "Of course. I'll give it to her tonight." She did not give it to me that night. She did not give it to me for 14 months. Instead, my mother took that little girl's drawing home, and she folded it up, and she slid it into the 2nd drawer of her dresser. The private one. Just below the top. Under the folded scarves. Are you still with me? Because I need you to understand the size of what she did. A dying 9-year-old spent some of her last strength drawing a picture as a gift. Her grieving mother carried it to a luncheon and put it into the hands of the one person she thought she could trust. And that woman hid it in a drawer next to her jewelry and said nothing, while the little girl who drew it died 3 weeks later still believing I would someday hold it in my hands. That is the woman who told me it was just a jacket. But the letter, the other one, the one Iris dictated, that one got away from her. Because the day after the luncheon, Dr. Voigt forwarded it to an old colleague she'd trained with 20 years earlier. A man named Dr. Everett Sloan. And Dr. Sloan had gone on to become the dean of admissions at one of the top medical schools in the country. Her note to him was one single line: "For when this applicant arrives." He read that letter. And then he put it in the second drawer of his desk, and he waited. He waited 14 months for a woman named Cora Ellison to walk through his door. I hadn't planned to apply that year. Iris died that November. I went to her funeral. So did her nurse, Tanya. So did my supervisor, Miriam, a social worker who'd been doing this heartbreaking work for 24 years. Marisol was there. We all were. You know who wasn't? My parents. My sister. None of them came. A few weeks after the funeral, Marisol showed up at my apartment holding a garment bag. Inside was a navy wool blazer, a good one. She told me it had been hers, years ago, from a job interview she'd worn it to before her husband died, and she hadn't touched it since. She pressed it into my arms and said, "Para tus entrevistas. Iris would want you to wear something with strength in it." That was the blazer. That's the one you already know about. I'd written a rough draft of my medical school essay months earlier, back in the spring, before Iris passed, even though I knew I wouldn't submit it until the next cycle. I wrote about her by name. I wrote about her window facing the train tracks. I wrote the exact sentence I'd said to her in Spanish on the first night we met. And I saved that draft where I'd saved every important document since high school, on the family shared cloud drive my mother had set up years before. I didn't know anyone else ever looked in that folder. I finally applied that fall. I got my interview invitation in January. And that's when my mother called me, sweet as sugar, and said, "Come home the night before, honey. Your father's making his pasta. Let's have a family dinner before your big day." You already know what happened at that dinner. You know about the iron, and the bleach, and my mother not lifting her eyes from her phone, and my father telling me not to ruin things for my sister. What you don't know yet is that I wore that ruined blazer to the interview anyway. The stain was 18 inches long and you could see it from across a room. My first interview that morning was warm and ordinary. My second was with the dean of admissions himself, Dr. Everett Sloan. The check-in assistant mentioned, almost in passing, he requested your slot specifically. That happens sometimes. I filed it away. I didn't understand it yet. At 11:15, I knocked on his door. Gray-haired, 60, soft-eyed, calm. He shook my hand and asked me to sit. And then he was quiet, 5 seconds longer than a person is normally quiet, and I realized he was looking at the stain on my blazer. Then he said, "Ms. Ellison. Tell me about a patient who changed how you think about medicine." I'd prepared 3 answers for that question. I used none of them. I told him about Iris. All of it. Her name, her diagnosis, her mother, Guatemala, the father she lost. The velveteen rabbit in the chemo room. Her window facing the train tracks, and what she whispered every single morning. I talked for 6 minutes and he never once interrupted. When I finished, he didn't ask another question. He stood up. He walked to the second drawer of his desk. He took out a thin folder, and from inside it, one folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk between us. He didn't turn it toward me yet. He said, "Ms. Ellison. I want to be sure I'm hearing what I think I'm hearing. Iris Delgado. Leukemia. Treated here in the city. Mother named Marisol, father deceased. The window facing the trains. The velveteen rabbit." He paused. "You're that Cora?" I said, "Yes." He sat back down slowly. He looked at the bleach on my blazer. He looked at the name on his screen. He looked at me. And he said, "I have been waiting 14 months to meet you." Then he turned the paper around. And I recognized the handwriting before I read a single word. Those careful little accent marks. The slope of the letters, the same slope as every note Marisol had ever sent me about Iris's appointments. It was Iris's voice, in her mother's hand. He read it out loud, slowly, no performance in his voice at all. To the people who choose who gets to be a doctor. Please choose Cora Ellison. She held my hand when I was scared. She said my words in Spanish when my mommy didn't know the English words. She read me the rabbit story in the chemo room. She is already a doctor in the ways that matter. Please. Iris Delgado, age 9. He set it down. He folded his hands. And then he told me there was a second piece of evidence in my file, one he could not legally show me in that room, because it had been submitted by someone else. But he could tell me this: someone in my own family had used pieces of Iris Delgado's story in their own application to that very school the year before. He'd noticed the overlap the moment my essay came in this fall. And he'd been waiting to meet me, to find out which version of the story was the true one. I sat very still. I did not say a word. Because in that exact second, I understood who had been reading the drafts I saved on that family drive. I understood everything. I drove the whole way home slower than I'd driven down. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment with my laptop and a yellow legal pad, and I opened the family cloud drive. I found my essay draft, the one about Iris. And I clicked on the version history. The document had been edited 23 times over 2 months. Every single edit was mine. But there was one entry that didn't match. One quiet line, buried in the log. 2:18 in the morning, the account name, Marguerite Ellison. No edits. Just, opened. Read. 13 minutes later, a text went out to my father. I'd learn about that text soon enough. So my mother had crept into my writing at 2 in the morning while I slept, read the most private thing I'd ever written about the little girl I'd loved and lost, and handed it to my sister to wear like a costume. I sat on that floor for a long time just looking at the timestamp. 2:18 in the morning. I kept picturing it. My mother, in her robe, in the blue light of a laptop, reading Iris's name, a child she'd never met, a child whose gift she was hiding in a drawer down the hall that very same season, and instead of feeling anything, doing the math. Deciding whose future it could buy. I'd spent my whole life believing my mother simply loved my sister more than me. Sitting there, I understood it was worse than that. She didn't see either of us as daughters. She saw us as investments. One had a better return. The strange thing is, that was the moment I stopped being angry. Anger needs a little bit of hope in it, hope that the person could have chosen differently. And right there on the floor, I let that hope go. What was left underneath wasn't rage. It was clarity. Cold and clean and steady. And clarity, it turns out, is a much more dangerous thing to bring into a room than anger ever was. The next day, I called my old supervisor, Miriam. She'd been a social worker for 24 years, and she kept records of every observer who ever set foot on that floor. I asked her one question: did she ever have any record of my sister Vivian shadowing there? There was a long pause. And then Miriam said, "Cora, she badged in 4 times in 3 years. Never more than an hour and a half at a stretch. She was never once in the Delgado child's room. I have the logs. Why are you asking me this?" I told her I'd call her back. Then I called my mother. She picked up bright and cheerful, the way she always did when she was performing for someone who wasn't there. "Cora, sweetheart. How did it go?" I didn't answer that. I said, "Mom. Did Vivian write about Iris Delgado in her medical school essay?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. And 4 seconds is a very long time on a phone call. My mother's surprise came a half beat too late. Because, and I want you to catch this, I never said Iris's last name. And my mother never asked me who Iris was. She just said, "Cora, you sound exhausted. Come home tonight. We'll talk." I said no. And I hung up. My mother knew the name. And I had never told her. That night, an email came from Dr. Sloan. He wanted a formal conversation. He was prepared to walk me through my options, including filing a complaint with the school's Committee on Honor and Professionalism, the body that handles cheating and fraud in admissions. He would need a written statement from me. And he would be contacting Dr. Voigt to confirm the chain of custody of Iris's letter. I had 2 weeks to gather every scrap of paper my mother had ever touched. If your heart is pounding right now, if some part of you is silently rooting for this thing to come all the way out into the light, type it for me, still here. Because that's what Iris used to say. And it's about to mean everything. The Honor Committee opened its case in early March. I sent them my original draft, with the cloud drive timestamps proving I'd written it in the spring, a full year before my sister submitted her application. I asked them to compare my essay with Vivian's, paragraph by paragraph. And Miriam came through. She pulled 3 files for me through the hospital's own records. My navigator log, 3,200 hours, my signature on every line. Vivian's visitor log, 4 visits, 5 hours and 22 minutes, never once in Iris's room. And the nurse Tanya's handoff notes, which mentioned me being with that family 38 separate times. Miriam clipped a note to the top. She wrote, "In 24 years, this is the cleanest contrast I've ever pulled from our records. Use it carefully. Use it once." Then Dr. Sloan called me. The committee had compared the essays. And there was one sentence: her window faced the tracks, and she watched for the first train even on the morning she couldn't eat, that appeared, word for word, in my sister's application. The odds of 2 sisters independently writing that exact sentence, about the same dying child, he said, were 0. But the committee wanted one more thing. Something physical. Anything else connected to Iris that my family still had. I knew exactly what they meant. I just didn't know yet where it was. And then, for the first time in 14 months, my father called me. He said, "Cora, I need to see you. Not your mother. Not your sister. Just me. There are things I should have said years ago. And there are things on my phone you need to see." We met at a little coffee shop 3 days later. He looked thinner than I remembered. He set his phone on the table between us and he wouldn't look at me, he just looked at the table. And he said, "I let her do this. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know." He turned the phone around and showed me a text thread between him and my mother, from that same night in the spring, 2:30 in the morning. My mother had written, "Just read Cora's draft. This Iris paragraph is the best writing anyone in this family has ever produced. Vivian has nothing close. Should I send it to her?" My father had written back, "Marguerite. That's Cora's work." And my mother had answered, "Cora isn't even applying this year. She's staying for the hospice thing. It's just giving Vivian material. Cora will write something else next year. We have one shot to get one of our girls into a school like this. This is parenting." There were 52 more messages after that. My father scrolled through every one of them. Then he did something I didn't expect. He airdropped the entire thread to my phone, all 52 screenshots, and then a voice memo he'd recorded alone in his car the night before. He looked at me and he said, "I should have said no." I said nothing. And I've learned that saying nothing is the same thing as saying yes. I walked out of that coffee shop with everything I needed. That weekend, my mother called and told me to come home. "Your father needs you here," she said. "This has gotten out of hand." I went. But not for her. She opened the front door with her arms folded. "Cora," she said, "we can fix this. Drop the complaint. We can make it all go away. Vivian doesn't deserve to lose her whole future over one sentence." I asked if I could use the upstairs bathroom. And I walked past her, up the stairs. Past my old bedroom. And into the master bedroom. I opened the second drawer of her dresser. Just below the top. The one she'd told me was private when I was 10 years old. The one I hadn't touched in 16 years. I moved the folded silk scarves aside. And underneath them, exactly where she said her private things lived, was a folded piece of hospital sketch paper. I unfolded it with my hands shaking. Pencil. A little girl in a hospital bed. A woman in scrubs beside her, holding her hand. The two of them looking at each other. And on the back, in shaky pencil letters. For when you graduate. Iris, age 9. I took a photograph of it right where it lay, in the drawer, so no one could ever say I planted it. Then I slid the original into the inside pocket of my coat, closed the drawer, and walked back downstairs. The whole family was in the dining room. Vivian's face was tear-streaked, but practiced. She'd already been notified the committee had opened an investigation. My father was staring at his plate. My mother was staring at me. I laid the drawing face up in the center of the table. And I said, quietly. This was handed to Mom by Marisol Delgado, at the donor luncheon, 14 months ago. It was meant for me. Mom kept it in her dresser drawer, second from the top, under the scarves. The little girl who drew this was 9 years old. She died 3 weeks later. Her name was Iris. Vivian opened her mouth. Cora, you don't understand. I cut her off. I didn't raise my voice. I never once raised my voice. I said, Vivian. I have your essay. I have my draft. I have the badge logs. I have Mom's texts to Dad. I have this drawing. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm telling you what's going to happen at that hearing. My mother reached across the table for the drawing. I put my hand flat on top of it, the same way she'd once closed that drawer on me. She pulled back. She said, you have no idea what you're doing. I picked up the sketch, and I held it where she could see it, and I said the truest thing I've ever said to my mother. Iris did. She knew before any of us. And I walked out of that house. I did not look back. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in a small conference room. On one side sat the committee, Dr. Sloan as chair, and 2 other faculty members. On the other side sat my sister, with the family attorney seated behind her as an advisor who wasn't allowed to speak. A camera on a tripod recorded everything. My old supervisor, Miriam, sat against the back wall as my professional reference. And on a laptop connected to a secure video line, Marisol was waiting to join. My parents were out in the hallway. They weren't permitted in the room. Dr. Sloan opened by stating the charge, academic misrepresentation in an admissions application. Then he turned to me and said, Ms. Ellison. The floor is yours. I started with the numbers. Because numbers don't cry, and numbers can't be called dramatic. Patient navigator log, I said. 3,200 hours. 1,100 of them with Iris Delgado and her mother. My signature on every entry. I set the next page down beside it. Visitor badge log for Vivian Ellison. 4 visits. 5 hours and 22 minutes, total, across 3 years. None of them inside Iris Delgado's room. My sister never met her. The attorney tried to object. Dr. Sloan raised one hand and said, Counsel, this is not a courtroom. This is a hearing about integrity. Continue, Ms. Ellison. I laid the 2 essays side by side, and I underlined one sentence in red on each. Mine, dated the spring. Vivian's, dated a year later. The same sentence about the window and the trains, word for word. Then, at 11:30, the video line connected. And Marisol's face filled the screen. Dr. Sloan asked her to confirm where Iris's letter had come from. She did. She described the day she'd written it, holding the pencil while her dying daughter told her each word. And then Dr. Sloan read Iris's letter out loud one more time, slowly, into that silent room. She held my hand when I was scared. She is already a doctor in the ways that matter. The room went quiet for 12 full seconds. I counted them. And here's what I want you to understand about that silence. My whole life, in my family, silence was a weapon. It was how you got told you didn't matter. Nobody had to say it, they just didn't say anything at all. The recital where my mother turned away. The dinner where my father set down his fork. All those years, silence in my house meant you're not the one. But this silence was different. This was a room full of serious people going still because they finally understood exactly what they were looking at. This silence was on my side. And Vivian, who had been crying the practiced, careful tears our family was so good at, stopped performing. And she started to cry for real. Dr. Sloan asked Marisol if she wanted to add anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in careful English with one line of Spanish woven through. My daughter Iris. She loved Cora. She did not know who Vivian was. She never met Vivian. I never met Vivian until the day I gave a drawing my daughter made to Mrs. Ellison, and Mrs. Ellison said she would give it to Cora, and she did not. My daughter died believing Cora had it. Cora only got it 5 days ago. I am here today because my little girl wrote a letter so that somebody would listen. So I am here, so that somebody listens. Then I placed the drawing on the table, and I told them where I'd found it, and that I had a photograph proving the drawer it came from. Dr. Sloan examined it. He passed it to the others. Then he turned to my sister and asked her, directly, whether she'd known the drawing existed. Vivian, choking, said, no. I never saw it. I swear I never knew. And I believed her, I truly did believe that part. My mother had kept that secret from all of us. Dr. Sloan called a 10-minute recess. And out in the hallway, in front of the attorney, in front of 3 strangers, in front of me, my father stood up, took one step toward my mother, and said the one word he had never once said to her in 30 years of marriage. My mother rushed toward Vivian's tear-streaked face, asking, what happened? What did they show in there? And my father said, low and level, Bridget, they have the drawing. You told me you forgot. You told me for 14 months that you forgot. And then, when she opened her mouth to spin it one more time, he said it. Don't. 1 syllable. And my mother, who had a smooth answer for everything, my whole life, went completely still. When we came back in, Vivian tried one last time. I was going through a hard time. My mother pushed me. I was only 21. Dr. Sloan let her finish. Then he said, gently and without mercy, Ms. Ellison, you were 21 when you submitted the application. You are 23 now. You have completed 8 months as an enrolled medical student. In all that time, you never once contacted this committee, or the Delgado family, to correct the record. The committee will weigh that. She had no answer. He turned to me. Ms. Ellison, would you like to make a closing statement? I did. I didn't attack anyone. I said. I'm not here to destroy my sister. I'm not here to humiliate my parents. I'm here because a 9-year-old girl wrote a letter so that I would finally be heard. And I have been heard now. So the committee can do what it does. But I'd like one thing entered into the record. Iris Delgado was a real person. She had a name. She had a window that faced the trains. She had a mother who loved her with everything she had. She had 1 nurse, and 1 social worker, and 1 navigator who walked all the way through it with her. She did not have my sister. She did not have my parents. She had us, and we are still here. That's what this is about. I sat down. Dr. Sloan closed the folder, and he said, the committee will be in touch. 2 weeks later, an email came from the medical school. Dear Ms. Ellison. It is our privilege to offer you a place in the entering class. Your file, your essay, and your interview reflected a candidate of extraordinary clinical insight and rare integrity. We hope you'll accept. I read it twice. I didn't cry. I just texted Marisol one word, yes. She wrote back, Iris knew. A week after that, the committee delivered its decision on my sister. Vivian was dismissed from medical school, effective immediately, for fraud in her admissions materials, and for staying silent about it for 8 months as an enrolled student. My father called me that afternoon. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He told me he was separating from my mother, that he'd already signed a lease, already paid the deposit. He said, "I'm just asking for the time to do the next part right. I'd like to see you, when you're ready." I told him I'd see him. I didn't say when. My mother sent me exactly one text. "You destroyed your sister. I hope it was worth it." I screenshotted it. I didn't reply. And I didn't block her. I just left it sitting there, unanswered, the way she'd left so many things. Because here's the thing. I didn't destroy anything. I just finally stopped holding it up. That spring, I drove out to see Marisol in her new apartment. She'd hung Iris's drawing on the wall above her little kitchen table, in a $3 frame she'd found at a thrift store. We ate lunch. We talked about Iris until we were both laughing and crying at the same time. And then she brought out a little sewing kit. A spool of white thread. A needle. She turned my bleached blazer inside out, and she opened the lining right over the spot where the heart sits when you button it. And slowly, carefully, with the afternoon light crossing the table, she stitched something in. When she was done, she turned it right side out and held it up to the window. The bleach stain was still there, that orange ghost of the worst night of my life, still running down the navy. But now, on the inside, where only I would ever know, was a single white letter. I. For Iris. She said, "Now she rides with you. Right here. And nobody can ever take her out again. I start medical school in a few weeks. In the same city, in the same building, that my sister had to leave. The blazer hangs on a hook by my front door, the stain still showing, the letter sewn in where only I can find it. And the drawing sits on the shelf right above it. My mother said it was just a jacket. She was wrong. She was wrong about most things. The story she spent 30 years building for our family, about which daughter mattered, and which one didn't, turned out to be just that. A story. But the letter a dying little girl wrote in one page of pencil, in her mother's hand, that one turned out to be the truth. So if you made it all the way to the end with me, thank you. Truly. If any of this reached the part of you that's been made to feel small, do one last thing before you go. Type one word for me in the comments, real. From the rabbit story. Because the horse was right. You don't get to feel real by how you were made, or by how your family decided to rank you. It happens to you slowly, over a long time, when someone finally sees you. Iris saw me. And now, maybe, you feel a little more seen too. If this story moved you, share it with one person who needs it tonight. Subscribe, so the next story finds you. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself. You were always the one who did the work. And it was always enough.